The entire town knew all about both rides, and the best-informed gossips insisted that Conway and Thurman had made some sort of wager, highly improper on the part of a minister, and that the mysterious payoff might come during the day of the Irish picnic. I was as curious as everyone else, so taking Rascal on my shoulder, I crossed the street to Thurman's parsonage, where he continued to work on his car. "I'd be glad to polish your brass radiator," I said. Reverend Thurman glared at me and Rascal. "The best way to polish a radiator is with a coon pelt, and if that animal of yours ever invades my property again—" "You wouldn't do that to my pet raccoon." "Oh, yes, indeed, I certainly would," said the terrible-tempered minister of the gospel. "I'll tack his hide right up in the woodshed. Thought you were going to lock him up in his cage like you promised." "In a few days," I said. You can see I've got him on a leash." "Step in the right direction," Thurman granted. I knew it was impolite, but my curiosity was now quite out of control. I was slightly shocked to hear myself asking, "What's your bet with Mike Conway, Reverend Thurman?" "Bet?" Thurman shouted. "What bet? Ministers never bet. Now you and your coon get out of here and stay out." We returned to our front porch, and Rascal and I sat in wicker chairs watching a veritable parade. Our street was in the direct route to the fairgrounds, and all the exhibits and livestock, the racehorses and the automobiles must come past us in review, as though we were judges or privileged guests. There were always a few well-groomed hunters and hackney ponies, thoroughbreds and Tennessee walking horses, five-gaiters and other pampered creatures moving with pride and grace toward assured white, red, or blue ribbons. But our region was one of working prosperity rather than effortless luxury, so most of our beautiful horses were of the draft breeds. We had massive Belgians, often weighing more than a ton, and standing 17 hands high. Suffolks, Clydesdales, and Percherons, all in the pulling contest. These tremendous and faithful animals were so brave and loyal to their masters that I could not watch them long in their heartbreaking performances. Apparently they would soon be outmoded by other forms of locomotion, passing our front row seat. Automobiles of every kind, from Fords to White Streamers to twin six Packards, the sulkies, Surreys, and neat green farm wagons with gleaming red wheels, moved very slowly by comparison to any automobile. My father was still in Montana, so this year he would not be with me, viewing the exhibits and watching the races. I raided my earthenware crock for my last handful of small silver, snapped the leash on Rascal, mounted my bicycle, and we were on our way. The world was sparkling and cool that bright September morning. The dust had been settled during the night by a sprinkle of rain, not enough to make a muddy track, just enough to put ozone in the air and dew on the grass. Whistling any tune that came into my head, I pedaled happily toward the fairgrounds with Rascal in the basket. In the traffic were additional guarantees of a good day: the pie wagon, the ice cream truck, which also carried many cases of root beer, the popcorn and crackerjack wagon, the balloon man riding a bicycle and blowing an enchanting little whistle that lured children as surely as the pipe of a Pied Piper. From up ahead within the fairgrounds we could hear the stream calliope playing "Come, Josephine" in my flying machine. And now the bright tents and the white buildings came into view, and we could hear the happy buzz and murmur of the crowd already gathering. Yes, this was certainly the day of the Irish picnic, worth coming miles to see. I put my bicycle in the bicycle rack under the grandstand, and with Rascal on my shoulder began to tour the grounds. We saw all the canned goods, quilts, and other fancy work in the home craft department. In another building we admired the huge pumpkins, Hubbard squashes and melons, the seed corn, apples, and grapes. It was a good thing that I had Rascal on a leash. He wanted to run his avid hands over everything he saw, like a woman shopper at a fire sale. In the case of the prize-winning bunch of grapes, I restrained him just in time. On visiting the livestock building, Rascal walked the top rail of the pens, utterly confident and unafraid. Calves and colts came over to say hello. The fattened lambs were also gentle, but a big Pollard China sow with her autumn litter was menacing, and a merino ram charged the fence on which Rascal was standing, moving like an oncoming locomotive and crashing his big curled horns into the wooden partition. Rascal would have been thrown into the pen by the heavy jolt if I had not literally dragged him from the danger by his leash. We were more careful after that, as we visited the horse pavilion to see again, at closer range, the beautiful animals we had been passing our house earlier in the morning. Most of the horses were not entered in any special event except the grand parade around the racetrack. They were judged in their pavilion by 3 craggy and serious horsemen brought in for the occasion, and some of the blue, red, and white ribbons had already been awarded, but out in the racing stables were the handsome trotters and pacers we would later watch in action. There were 2-year-olds, both colts and fillies, who would compete in the Junior Classic. They were high-spirited young things with fire and mischief in their eyes, and I kept Rascal well back from the paddock doors. Most of the 3-year-olds were better behaved, and of course there was Donnybrook, who wickered his greeting and nuzzled Rascal affectionately. In 2 of the last 3 years he had won the Senior Classic, and I think he knew we were pulling for him. It was pure delight to be showing Rascal all this for the first time, and he was constantly interested in all that he saw. We rode the merry-go-round together, Rascal sitting ahead of me on the wooden pony, going gaily up and down, round and round. He wanted a second ride, but I had to be careful of my dimes, or we would never get through the day without going bankrupt. We couldn't resist the Ferris wheel, however. It was the biggest one that had ever come to the Irish picnic, and when we reached the top we could see all the way to the village of Albion, far beyond the marshes. Height didn't frighten either of us. It was a little like flying up to soar and coming down again. Rascal would gladly have ridden all day, and so would I, but the silver in my pocket was disappearing far too rapidly. It didn't cost anything to enter the 3-legged race. But when I saw some of those long-legged 14-year-old teams, I knew that Oscar Sunderland and I didn't have a chance. Instead, we decided to enter another free event soon to begin, the pie-eating contest. Gabbling happily about Rascal and the coming muskrat season, we walked toward the long plank table and adjoining benches laid out with 20 blueberry pies. "I seen a mink track today," Oscar said. "Lives in the tile that drains Mud Lake. You got your traps oiled?" "Not yet, but I sent to St. Louis for our fur catalogs." "Boy, we're going to make a fortune this fall. We're going to be filthy rich." "I could use some money," I admitted. "I'm just about stone broke." "Gee, so am I. Flat busted. Say, look at that pie." "Not as good as your mother makes." "She does make good pie at that," Oscar admitted. "Mom's all right." We sat down on either side of the table, 10 boys on each side. Our hands were tied behind our backs, and while we awaited the starting gun, we shouted happy insults at each other. The object of this messy contest was to eat the full-sized pie faster than any other contestant. You had to eat it with your face and pull the pie tin back with your teeth if it started slipping beyond reach. I noticed a knot in the wide plank that might be helpful. If I could maneuver the pie tin right up against that knot, I could really dig in. Then I discovered I was directly across the table from Slammy Stillman, and I knew this would be the toughest pie-eating contest I ever entered. Slammy was the biggest, greediest, meanest 12-year-old in town. We hated each other with a fine, soul-satisfying hatred born of many fistfights in which I was always outweighed and outslugged, but by boyhood rules you could never refuse to fight. We glared at each other balefully. This was a grudge fight to the last blueberry and the last crumb of pie crust. Bang! We were off with a good juicy plunge through the crust and deep into the berries. The knot in the plank helped a little, but not enough. It held the pie tin for about 3 good slurps, and then it slipped. There was so much commotion, noise, and splattering of blueberries, with some boys practically lying on the table trying to recover their pie tins, that it was hard to see who was winning. The crowd around us was roaring with laughter, but it wasn't very funny to us. We were desperate, exasperated, covered with blueberries, and breathing hard. Everyone wanted the $3 grand prize, not to mention the glory and the blue ribbon. I was practically certain that only Slammy Stillman was ahead of me, and I didn't see how I could ever catch up. Then my best friend came to the rescue. Rascal knew all about pies, and he loved blueberries. He leaped to the table and started helping me eat my pie, licking it at a wonderful rate. Best of all, he was working from the other side of the pie, adding 5 1/2 pounds of raccoon to the resistance already supplied by the knot. My tin scarcely slipped at all. Sammy Stillman was the first to notice. He was completely infuriated. This character, who never abided by any rules, started screaming, "Cheater! Cheater! Look at that cheater!" While Slammy was yelling as he couldn't eat his pie, Rascal and I were gaining on him fast. The judges were laughing so hard they couldn't catch their breath to shout a ruling. Rascal and I came in strong on the last lick, 1/8 of a pie ahead of our nearest competitor, who luckily was Oscar Sunderland. Neither Spaulding nor Hoyle has ever published a handbook on pie-eating contests, and the judges went into a huddle that became vociferous. Rascal and I were partially disqualified. Oscar got the $3 and the blue ribbon, which made me happy because Oscar was my trapping partner and nearly as penniless as me. But I received the consolation prize, a real league baseball autographed by every member of our local team. Slammy would have been red in the face if he hadn't been completely blue in the face. All day long he grumbled and threatened, shouting "cheater" whenever he saw me and my raccoon. It was a delicious victory. The September sun was directly overhead, but for some reason Rascal and I didn't respond to the dinner bells being rung by warm and hearty matrons serving food in several denominational tents. On the Methodist menu was roast chicken with dressing, 3 vegetables, and a blueberry pie. It was this last item that convinced me we didn't need a noonday meal. At 2 in the afternoon, the horse races began. A beautiful bay filly from Janesville nosed out the favorite colt from Madison in the Junior Classic. She had the movements of a Swiss watch. Lifting her feet proudly, her muscles rippled smoothly, and after this upset, the 3-year-olds performed more predictably with a magnificent pacer from Staunton, breaking the record for 8 furlongs. As race followed race, however, the spectators asked each other, "Where's Donnybrook?" Mike Conway was not tiring his black stallion. Much as he enjoyed winning the Senior Classic, he had another aim in view today, the all but impossible hope that he could outrun a greater menace than any competing horse, in fact, Gabriel Thurman's Model T. There are probably no more than 50 trotters who have pulled a sulky 1 mile in 2 minutes. Possibly 90 pacers have achieved this immortality. Generally speaking, it takes a great horse in harness racing to speed 1 furlong in 15 seconds, or 1 mile in 2 minutes. Similarly, unless handled by a racing driver, few early Fords could top twice this speed, 60 miles an hour or a mile a minute. The mathematics of this race seemed obvious. A very fast trotter was matched against a well-attuned Ford. By any sensible odds, Reverend Gabriel Thurman should have been asked to drive his Tin Lizzie 4 times around the half-mile oval, while Donnybrook wheeled Mike Conway twice around this track. All through the grandstand, we could see the news spread swiftly. Mike had bet that he could go twice around the track, while Thurman and his Ford made a mere 3 rounds. There was one shrewd catch, however. Donnybrook needed no cranking, and Thurman must wait for the starting gun before cranking his Ford, jumping into his roadster, and streaking off after the stallion and his master. Mike Conway had watched this impatient and impetuous Gabriel Thurman crank his Ford on many occasions. He knew that Thurman always took reckless chances in 3 departments. He placed the gas and also the spark lever much too low. When aggravated, he always jerked the choke wire, which emerged at the left of the crank, thus flooding his carburetor. Mike was no mechanic, but he had often used his stopwatch on Thurman's futile attempts to start his car. Gabriel Thurman was aware of this impetuosity. He knew that in eagerness to make his Ford rumble and roar, he caused backfires that nearly broke his arm. He was being tremendously cautious, putting the spark and gas barely below the permissible level, and promising himself he would not touch the ring attached to the wire that primed the carburetor. The flag was lowered, the barrier raised, and Mike and Donnybrook were off in a flash. It was a sheer joy to watch that stallion lift his white stockinged feet. Mike rode comfortably on the seat of the sulky, as much a part of his trotter as though he had been astride. Gabriel Thurman gave the crank a whirl and was nearly knocked into dust by the backfire. He rushed to his steering wheel, adjusted gas and spark, and tried once again. A very small pop created such exasperation that the minister pulled the priming wire with desperate yank. The carburetor flooded until it dripped gas beneath the car. By this time, Mike Conway and Donnybrook had completed a full round of the track and had only 1 more to go. By luck rather than skill, Thurman now started his Ford, and off he blasted, sounding his klaxon and pulling his gas lever to the lowest notch. This was almost an even race if the Ford could make 60 miles an hour while Donnybrook held 30. On the open road, Thurman might have won, but taking the curves without leaping the fence was his problem. Donnybrook crossed the finish line leading by 2 lengths, the indisputable winner. There was one other reward for Rascal and me. Donnybrook moved over to the fence where my raccoon was watching and waiting eagerly. With more than 1,000 spectators enjoying the sight, Donnybrook nuzzled Rascal, while Rascal ran his hands over the stallion's nose and bridle. Once again, we had tasted victory. I came home in the early evening to the empty house. I called the telegraph office and the railroad station to learn if my father had wired from Montana, telling me when he was coming home, but of course he had sent no message. I took Rascal to his cage and sat for a long time talking to him and then petting him while he ate his evening meal. Then, steeling myself to the dreadful deed, I stepped from the cage and closed the door behind me, hooking it firmly on the outside. Rascal didn't understand what had happened at first. He came over to the door and asked me politely to open it and let him out. Then he thought suddenly struck him that he was trapped, caged, and imprisoned. He ran around swiftly around the square of the wire, then into the barn through the hole I'd cut and all over the inside enclosure, then back again, frantic now. I went into the house to get away from his voice, but it came to me through the open windows, pleading, terrified, asking for me, telling me he loved me and had always trusted me. After a while, I couldn't stand it any longer, and I went out and opened the wire door. He clung to me and cried and talked about it, asking the unanswerable question. So I took him to bed with me, and we both fell into a fitful sleep, touching each other again and again throughout the night for reassurance.